Ancient Europe. Hilda Ellis Davidson. There was a rich diversity of religious beliefs throughout ancient Europe, the landmass stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the mountains of the Caucasus. The peoples about whose beliefs and religious practices we know the most are the Greeks and Romans in southern Europe, but we also have some knowledge of the early religion of the Celtic and Germanic peoples in the northwest. They were made up of many separate tribes, and some penetrated at various times into southern and eastern Europe. Their religion was not centrally organized, and was preserved in oral tradition, but archaeology and the study of later literature have added considerably to our knowledge. Early Europe. The inhabitants of Europe whom the Romans viewed as barbarians consisted of small tribal groups, ruled by petty kings and warrior leaders. Consequently, their history is confused and complicated, and there were no major religious centers in pre-Roman times influencing large areas of Europe. The tribes fought with one another, made alliances and formed larger groups from time to time, and a number came under the domination of Rome. When the Roman Empire collapsed, there was considerable movement of peoples, and larger permanent kingdoms were established. Map 8.1. Some Germanic tribes penetrated into Italy, and Rome itself was taken over in the last part of the 5th century, to be ruled by Theodoric the Ostrogoth from 493 to 526. The Franks obtained possession of Gaul, and the Anglo-Saxons settled in England. Most of the Celtic peoples in continental Europe, in Gaul and in the west and north of the British Isles, were converted to Christianity by the 5th century CE, and the Germanic kingdoms a little later, but in the north the conversion of Scandinavia was not complete until well after 1000 CE. Table 8.1 Chronology of Ancient Europe. End of Major Ice Age in Northern Europe. Circa 9000 BCE. Raising of Stonehenge. Circa 2800. Raising of Avebury. Circa 2500. Bronze Age in Northern Europe. c. 1500 to 500. Flag Fen. c. 1350 to 950. Roman invasion of England. c. 43 CE. Patrick's mission to Ireland. c. 456. Period of Germanic expansion, migration period. 3rd to 6th centuries. Settlement of Anglo-Saxons in England. From c. 400. Augustine brings Christianity to Kent. 597. Sutton Hoo ship burial. c. 625. Osberg ship burial. c. 835. Period of Viking expansion, Viking Age. c. 780 to 1070. Settlement of Iceland. From 870. Ansgar's mission to Denmark. 849. Olaf Tryggvason begins conversion of Norway. 995. Christianity accepted in Iceland. 1000. In northern and eastern Europe, the Finns, Balts and Slavs have left little record of their early religious beliefs and myths. Some figures of Slav gods have survived, and there is evidence for worship of deities and spirits associated with the natural world before the introduction of Christianity into Russia in the 10th century. There is much to be learned from folk songs, oral poetry, chants recorded at local ceremonies and descriptions of fertility customs in Russia and among the people of the Caucasus such as the Arsetes. Records survive of the religion of the Old Prussians, a Baltic people conquered in the 13th century by the Teutonic Knights, and of pre-Christian traditions among the Sami people of Lapland, some of whom were not converted until the 18th century. However, the material as a whole is fragmentary, with little definite recording of myths, and so is hard to interpret with confidence. Scandinavian mythology. The richest body of evidence comes from Scandinavia and above all from Iceland, settled from Norway in the late 9th century CE. Christianity was not formally accepted there until 1000 CE, and the Icelanders took great pride in their history. Map 8.1. Northern Europe, showing places mentioned in text. Map 8.2. Viking Expeditions, Trading, Raiding, Exploration and some settlement, 8th to 11th centuries CE. And traditions. Myths, legends, poems and accounts of the independent state which they founded were recorded as soon as they learned to write following their conversion, and they even preserved some mythological poetry from the pre-Christian period. Moreover, a gifted writer, Snorri Sturluson, who although a Christian was neither a monk nor a cleric, set out to record mythological lore in the early 13th century, since he feared that the old poetry would cease to be understood. He wrote with wit, eloquence and enthusiasm, quoting many passages from early poems, so that young poets could be familiar with the old tales and understand mythological allusions. Snorri was both a historian and a poet, although also an active participant in politics, which resulted in his assassination in 1241. Another writer in Denmark at about the same time as Snorri was the learned Saxo Grammaticus, writing in Latin in an elaborate style. Although he had little sympathy with the old beliefs, he used some of the tales to enrich his account of the early history of the Danes, and to illustrate his ideas about the duties of kingship. He was also a gifted storyteller, and has preserved some accounts of otherworld adventures and encounters with supernatural beings. We have versions of many early myths from Old Norse literature, mostly composed in Iceland. Some short poems go back to the pre-Christian period, although their complex style makes them difficult to interpret. These were composed by Icelandic skalds, professional poets, many of whose names we know. A different style of poetry is preserved in the manuscript collection of poems from the Codex Regius, known as the Poetic or Elder Edda to distinguish it from the Prose Edda of Snorri Sturluson. These are either narrative or riddling dialogue poems, and they are divided into two sections, one on gods and the other on heroes. There are later prose editions by an editor, but the identity of editor and poets remains unknown. The manuscript was written in the 13th century, but individual poems clearly vary in date. One of the most important, Völuspá, telling of the creation and destruction of the world of gods and humankind, is thought to have been composed about 1000 CE. Some additional information about the gods is found in the opening section of Heimskringla, an account of the kings of Norway by Snorri Sturluson. There are also legendary sagas known as sagas of old times, which contain some pre-Christian material. Germans and Celts. The Scandinavians were related to the Germanic peoples from Central Europe, who were neighbors of the Celts. In the 1st century CE, Celts and Germans were speaking languages related to those of a number of other peoples in Europe and part of Asia, extending as far as India. These had all developed from an earlier language which we call Indo-European, spoken in Eurasia about 6,000 years ago, Table 8.2. There is still vigorous debate as to the Indo-European homeland, and claims have been made for Anatolia, the Pontic-Caspian steppe and southern Russia, while there is as yet no final agreement as to how Indo-European developed into so many later languages, including Latin, Slavonic, Iranian and Sanskrit, as well as those of the Celtic and Germanic groups. The question is relevant for the study of early religions in Europe, since it has been claimed that some of the widespread myths go back to Indo-European times. The Celtic peoples occupied large areas of Central and Western Europe from about the 5th century BCE, and moved as far east as Galatia, map 8.3. Although no Celtic literature survives from continental Europe, there is a rich body of early poetry and prose from Ireland and some from Wales which, although composed in Christian times, preserves some early myths and traditions. There is also much splendid art in stone and metal from Celtic areas surviving from pre-Roman times. While the main structure of the early mythology of the Celtic and Germanic peoples in Europe has been lost, much scholarly work on literary texts from the British Isles has thrown light on individual myths and early gods and goddesses. Moreover, discoveries made in the course of the 20th century archaeology have led to a fuller understanding of cults and symbols. Much of our knowledge comes from provinces taken over by the Romans, who often gave local deities Roman names, and set up altars or memorials to them. This happened in England after it became a Roman province in the 1st century CE. Later it became part of the Germanic world when the Anglo-Saxons settled there, but since the settlers soon adopted Christianity, little of their earlier religious beliefs has been recorded. For Germanic religion in Central Europe we rely chiefly on Roman writers such as Tacitus, Julius Caesar and Dio Cassius. They were accepted as reliable evidence in the 18th and 19th centuries, but are now subject to question, since it is felt that we may have been misled into seeing both Celtic and Germanic religion through Roman eyes. The Romans tended to assume that each deity concentrated on one particular field, such as warfare or fertility, but those of the Celts and Germans appear to have been more complex in their nature than Roman writers indicated. As archaeological discoveries increased, certain types of art in early Europe came to be identified as Celtic. The so-called Hallstatt culture flourished about. Table 8.2 Development of Indo-European language. Germanic. German, English, Swedish, Norwegian, Icelandic, Dutch, Flemish, Frisian. Celtic. Irish, Gaelic, Welsh, Cornish, Breton. Italic. Latin, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. Baltic. Latvian, Lithuanian, Old Prussian. Slavic. Russian, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, Serbo-Croat, Czechoslovak, Polish. Greek. Modern Greek. Illyrian. Albanian. Armenian. Modern Armenian. Iranian. Arcetic, Persian, Kurdish. Indo-Iranian. Indic. Modern Indian languages, Hindustani, Bengali, etc. The 8th century BCE, and was held to be Celtic after the huge cemetery by Lake Hallstatt was excavated in 1846. Later Celtic art was defined as Latin, after a site in Switzerland dating from about 100 BCE, where many precious objects had been thrown into the water. The Latin period is held to have begun about 500 BCE, when a new style of winding, twisting patterns appeared on stone and metalwork. Foliage, spirals and tendrils were linked with Mediterranean motifs, and there was powerful, realistic treatment of animals and birds. This style continued to develop in Christian art in Celtic areas of the British Isles, and is found on carved stone crosses and in illuminated manuscripts. Discovery of the mythology. When Jacob Grimm wrote his preface to Deutsche Mythologie in 1844, he expressed regret that so little work had been done on Celtic material. Irish manuscripts were then virtually inaccessible to scholars, and tales from the Irish sagas and from Wales and Scotland were seen as rude and barbaric, even though a romantic interest in the Druids developed in the 18th century. However, by the early years of the 20th century the early literature of Ireland was viewed differently, as the result of the work of a group of writers which included the poet Yeats, and the brilliant translations of many tales and legends by Lady Gregory. An interest in early myths now became part of the national movement for the independence of Ireland. Similarly, a new interest in the Germanic past was kindled in the 19th century as a result of the work of the Grimm brothers, who began collecting folklore and folktales, believing that these preserved traces of pre-Christian myths and legends. Jacob Grimm continued to work on early language, folklore and beliefs all his life, and his 4 volumes on Germanic mythology were produced between 1883 and 1888. He used little Scandinavian material, except for comparison, since he felt that this was already accessible to scholars. Serious study of early religion in Scandinavia had begun in France and England a century earlier, when the Danish king Christian VII engaged the French scholar Mallet to write a history of Denmark in his own language. Mallet's introduction contained an account of the primitive worship of the northern nations, and in 1770 an English translation of this was made by Bishop Percy with his own notes and commentary. He had already published 5 pieces of runic poetry translated from the Icelandic language in 1768. About the same time the poet Thomas Gray composed 2 verse translations of old Icelandic poems. The Fatal Sisters. Map 8.3. Expansion of Celtic peoples by the 3rd to 4th centuries BCE. Map 8.4. Expansion of Germanic peoples, 1st to 5th centuries CE. And the descent of Odin, although his comments show that he knew little of the mythological background. In the course of the 19th century, a series of good translations of verse and prose from Old Icelandic were made by such scholars as George West Dasent, from 1842 onwards, Benjamin Thorpe and E.J. Powell. Richard Cleasby began work in Copenhagen on an Old Icelandic English dictionary, and after his untimely death this was continued by the Icelandic scholar Gudbrand Vigfússon, and was published by the Clarendon Press in 1869. English poets were stirred by the Norse myths. Matthew Arnold published Baldur Dead, a narrative poem, in 1855, based on Mallet's account of the myth of the gods' slaying, and William Morris' long epic poem, Sigurd the Volsung and the Fall of the Nibelungs, appeared in 1875 and won much acclaim. This tells the story of the legendary hero favored by the god Odin, who slew a dragon and gained a great treasure but met with an early death. The poet and artist William Morris began to study Icelandic with Eiríkur Magnusson in 1858, and their partnership was to have an enormous effect on Norse studies. Magnusson, the son of a poor Icelandic parson, came to England to help with the production of an Icelandic New Testament for the British and Foreign Bible Society. He proved an inspiring teacher, and Morris became fascinated by the old Icelandic sagas and poems, brought out a series of English translations of the prose sagas in a pseudo-medieval style, and visited Iceland to study the background of the tales. The operas of Richard Wagner, beginning with the Nibelungs in 1848, aroused an even greater interest in Norse mythology. He based them on the German version of the story of Siegfried, corresponding to the Norse Sigurd the Volsung, preserved in the medieval Nibelungenlied, a long courtly epic of the late 13th century. However, Wagner had also read some of the Icelandic material in translation, and brought the northern god Odin with the Valkyries who served him, together with the troublemaker Loki, into his series of operas making up the Cycle of the Ring. The splendid productions of Wagner's operas gave a new significance to the old myths, since he used them to express his aspirations for a stronger national identity for Germany. Early myths were also revived and associated with a new spirit of nationalism in Finland, where Elias Lönnrot published the Kalevala in 1835-49. This is a long epic poem made up from verse narratives, chants and laments collected and recorded by him in remote parts of the country. Although this work has been pieced together and contains no coherent mythology, there are many supernatural characters and tales of otherworld adventures to be found in it. In seeking to establish the nature of ancient religion and mythology in Northern Europe, it is necessary to take into account the effect of later creative artists and writers who were inspired by the early myths from the 18th century onwards. They have helped to shape our perceptions of the religious beliefs of the past, and our attitude towards them. Interest in the Celtic Druids has resulted in various attempts to revive them from the 18th century onwards. They were believed to have been the builders of Stonehenge and to have possessed deep secrets of ancient wisdom. Then came the claim of Edward Williams, whose bardic name was Ilo Morganach, in the last quarter of the century that the bards of Glamorganshire had preserved the wisdom of the Druids virtually intact, and he forged documents to prove this, based on some knowledge of early Welsh literature. He succeeded in linking a druidical court of bards of the island of Britain with the Welsh national Eisteddfod, and so brought new vigour into a declining institution. Many wild publications appeared, and the Ancient Order of Druids was set up in London in 1781. Numerous modern Druid orders have since sprung up in Europe, Australia and America, including some for women. Competing bodies of modern Druids have met at Stonehenge on ceremonial occasions from the late 19th century onwards, particularly at dawn on Midsummer Day, although recently such meetings have been limited to small groups because of possible damage to the stones. Attempts to re-establish the pre-Christian Nordic religion came much later, but there have been increasing attempts to do this since the 1950s. The Pagan Federation was founded in London in 1971, and is a coordinating body linking a number of pagan groups. Such groups are very varied, and flourish in the United States, particularly in California. Some call themselves Odinists, and attempt to follow the traditions of the group of Scandinavian gods and goddesses preserved in the early literature of Iceland, while in Iceland the group styling themselves the Asatruamenn, believers in the Aesir, was officially recognized as a sect in 1973, aiming to restore the ancient religious rituals of the 9th century there. In addition, we have the varied groups in England who call themselves Wicca. Their claim to represent a genuine revival of pre-Christian religion rests largely on the work of the Egyptologist Margaret Murray, who in her old age became convinced that the people persecuted for witchcraft in Northern Europe were members of the old religion, which continued underground until the end of the Stuart regime in the 17th century. This was further strengthened by the novels and books of Gerald Gardner, a retired colonial civil servant, in touch with various groups working with magic, who started a somewhat disreputable museum of witchcraft in the Isle of Man. His claims for the origins of Wicca show little knowledge of historical sources and are based largely on the theories of Margaret Murray. As Ronald Hutton points out in his description of the new paganism, the weakness of such claims is that the distinction between religion and magic is ignored, since the fundamental idea of witchcraft, that of raising a supernatural power in order to achieve what is desired, differs fundamentally from what we know of the worship of the deities of pre-Christian Europe. The increasing interest in new paganism, claimed to be a revival of the beliefs held before the coming of Christianity, is partly based in a desire to escape from a materialistic and cynical age and to win back the ancient lost wisdom which earlier peoples are assumed to have possessed. There is, however, a deep-seated reluctance to gain more knowledge about the lost faiths and rituals. This was shown in 1999 in the violent emotional protests made against the decision of English Heritage to remove from the sea at Old Hunston in Norfolk the central inverted free trunk with remains of the circle of timbers surrounding it which was discovered there. Removal was carried out to prevent its inevitable destruction and to discover more about its character and the way in which it had been set up. Both archaeologists and protesters cared intensely about this unique monument from the pre-Christian past, and the pity is that this resulted in hostility rather than cooperation. Many of those seeking to revive the early religions concentrate on the ancient worship of the goddess, which has a strong appeal to feminists, and has been strengthened by the devoted studies of Maria Gimbutas. Others seek to identify the fragmentary beliefs known from pre-Christian Europe with the teaching of old and well-established religions such as that of ancient Egypt, Hinduism and Tibetan Buddhism, and also with Native American beliefs. Workshops for the study of shamanism and attempts to revive its practices in the present day and make use of them for healing and the solving of psychological problems have been set up by the Scandinavian Center for Shamanic Studies in Denmark. The various groups who seek to rediscover the wisdom of the ancients tend to turn towards nature religion, and some link their ideas about the pre-Christian religion in very early times with earth mysteries. The idea of early prehistoric sacred sites linked by straight lines goes back to the 19th century, but the work of Alfred Watkins on the Old Straight Track in the 1920s, and that of John Mitchell, who wrote The View Over Atlantis in 1968, gave this new impetus. The ley lines proposed by Watkins came to be viewed as magnetic paths for spaceships bringing extraterrestrial visitants, and also as a source of divine energy. The theories of Alexander Thom and Ewan Mackie, who claim that the measurements of prehistoric monuments show that early priests possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy and mathematics, are not generally accepted by prehistorians, but have encouraged those looking back to the Neolithic period as a time of mystical wisdom. A further source of new pagan material has come from folklore, which from the time of the Grimms has been regarded as a rich source of information about pre-Christian beliefs. While some traditions may go back far into the past, further work by folklorists has shown that many are of comparatively recent origin, perhaps deliberately introduced by local antiquaries. As with early literature and place names, it is necessary to proceed here with caution, investigating each individual problem with an open mind, as Jacob Grimm himself advocated. In the lively interest in the beliefs of the long past which flourishes in society today, there is both promise and danger. We need to realize how the approach to the pre-Christian religion has varied in different periods, and to take this into account in any estimation of its nature in ancient Europe. Interpretation. The medieval viewpoint. Apart from rare exceptions like the gifted Snorri Sturluson, medieval writers who described the northern deities and retold the myths were usually monks. Their normal reaction was to view such gods as demons battling against Christ, and delighting to lead mortals astray. Snorri countered this by arguing that after the flood as recounted in the Bible, men forgot the Creator God, but continued to feel that some major power must have created the world. They gave various names to this power, one of which was Odin, the leader of the northern deities. This approach allowed Snorri to consider the beliefs of his forebears sympathetically, without condemnation. He thought too that the concepts of some gods might be based on admiration for famous leaders of the heroic past, leading poets and storytellers to regard them as divine figures. Saxo Grammaticus, who did not approve of the heathen gods, also felt that they may have developed out of powerful men of the past, perhaps sorcerers who came to be regarded as divine. The theorists. From the beginning of the Christian era, then, we can discern changing attitudes to the earlier myths. In the early 19th century, Jacob Grimm knew that the old Germanic religion was linked with that of the Scandinavians, and in an early preface of 1844 he made claims for its richness. However, rather than putting forward theories as to its origins, he set out to assemble and arrange relevant material. In his preface to Deutsche Mythologie he objects to the mania of foisting metaphysical or astronomical solutions on but half-discovered historical data, an enlightened attitude which gives enduring value to his work. Other scholars, unlike Grimm, were determined to find some prevailing theory to explain and provide a basis for the fragmentary evidence for cults and deities in Europe. In the second half of the 19th century, a vigorous debate went on for years between the German scholar Max Müller, lecturing on philology and early Indian religions at Oxford, and the Scottish historian and journalist Andrew Lang, who concentrated on new evidence provided by anthropologists. Both were prolific writers and eloquent debaters, with bodies of devoted followers. Müller had discovered links between the names of classical deities of Greece and Rome and those preserved in Sanskrit in the Vedic literature of India. He traced such names as Zeus and Jupiter back to an Indo-European form *dius pate, and believed that this proved belief in an early deity known as Father Sky worshipped by those speaking the Indo-European language. He claimed that all mythology was based primarily on the sun, which dispelled the darkness and caused fertility, while other natural phenomena might also play a part. Some of his followers preferred to stress the importance of the storm wind or the fire of the lightning. One example of such an approach was an interpretation of the Anglo-Saxon epic poem Beowulf, in which the hero overcomes the monster Grendel who lurks in the barren wastes and makes attacks on the hall of the Danish king. This was claimed to be based on the power of the life-giving sun to overcome the dangerous mists of the fens and marshes. Similarly, the Irish scholar Thomas O'Rahilly, whose work on early history and mythology appeared in 1946, saw one outstanding character after another in the Irish tales as representing the sun god with his flaming sword. This god he regarded also as the guardian of the lightning, while other heroes played the part of the youthful god fated to destroy him. One weakness of solar mythology was that scholars failed to agree over the identification of possible solar deities. O'Rahilly hailed the one-eyed god Baldur as the sun god, and the powerful god Lugh as his youthful adversary, but other Celtic scholars such as Eleanor Hull and Sir John Rhys believed that Lugh with his shining face and his hero son Cu Chulainn developed out of earlier sun gods. Scandinavian mythology offered further problems, since the leader of the gods, Odin, had none of the characteristics of a solar deity. The god who possessed the hammer of the lightning was Thor, the thunder god, corresponding to the Germanic Dana, god of the sky, while the god whose name was thought to be linked with that of Zeus, the Greek sky god, was a different deity, the Germanic *Tiwaz. He was remembered in Scandinavia as Tyr, the god who bound the wolf which threatened the gods. Max Müller's doughty opponent, Andrew Lang, had very different ideas about the origin of early European myths. He believed that they simply developed out of earlier forms of culture, such as may still be found among so-called primitive peoples in remote parts of the world. While Müller explained the tale of the Greek god Kronos devouring his offspring as based on the drying up of clouds by the sun, Lang accounted for it by the practice of cannibalism in early societies. In Myth, Ritual and Religion. Published in 1887, he strove to show how many strange and barbaric features in the myths could be paralleled by customs surviving in various parts of the world. Lang was much influenced by E. V. Taylor and the evolutionists, who claimed that religion developed from very primitive beginnings. Müller, however, had a higher opinion of the intelligence of early peoples, believing them capable of metaphorical and poetic ways of thinking. Their imaginative descriptions had in many cases, he felt, been taken literally, through what he called the disease of language. Lang was eventually forced to concede some ground, because it was impossible to deny the concept of a European sky god, but his evolutionary approach became the generally accepted one when it was further developed by Sir James Fraser in The Golden Bough. Fraser was a classical scholar who collected an immense amount of evidence from anthropologists and folklorists, although he himself did no fieldwork and was something of a recluse. He was able to go further than his predecessors in discerning underlying patterns in widely scattered evidence, and was to have an enormous influence in the first half of the 20th century. His first two books, based on classical material, appeared in 1890, and he then extended his range to include Germanic and Celtic myths and the folklore and customs of his own time. He viewed religion as an inevitable but limited stage in human development, developing into ritual through the activities of cunning magicians. He believed it must be gradually rejected as scientific explanations were discovered for the mysterious phenomena of the natural world, and myths to him were early misguided attempts to explain such mysteries. He was greatly influenced by the German scholar Wilhelm Mannhardt, who had collected beliefs and customs in Germany and surrounding countries associated with plants, trees and the growing of crops. Mannhardt saw the basic source of inspiration in early religion in Europe as the death of vegetation in winter followed by the growth of new life in the spring, fostering belief in spirits of the trees and the corn. In the past, such beliefs resulted in human and animal sacrifice, which he thought had left a mark on many customs associated with seed time and harvest. Much of his evidence was adopted by Fraser in The Golden Bough. Fraser also believed that early kings were ritually sacrificed and replaced by young successors in order to maintain the land's fertility, and that this had a profound influence on European myths. Such theories attracted extremists like Lord Raglan, for whom the ritual death of kings formed the basis of all myth. Margaret Murray, a distinguished Egyptologist who after retirement became interested in the study of witchcraft in Scotland, took up such ideas in the 1920s. She became convinced that many Anglo-Saxon, Norman and later kings of England who died violent deaths had been ritually sacrificed in this way, through the activities of members of an underground religion. On the other hand, the so-called myth and ritual school, partly developing from Fraser's work on early myths, resulted in valuable insights into the religions of the Near East, and S. J. Hook and E. O. James produced a number of important studies on myth from the 1930s onwards. Hook viewed myth as the spoken part of ritual, the words uttered possessing the efficacy of an act. The importance of kingship rituals in both Scandinavia and Ireland makes such studies relevant for the better understanding of pre-Christian religion in northwestern Europe. Fresh approaches. The question of myth was further developed by other scholars who reacted against Fraser's theories. In 1917, Rudolf Otto had claimed in Das Heilige that religion arose out of an independent form of experience for which he used the term numinous. A Romanian scholar, Mircea Eliade, who later worked at Chicago, studied general patterns in religion over a wide area of the world as Fraser had done, but with very different results. He held that myths were intended to reveal how the world and the activities of society came into being, and that they were the means of recreating such beginnings. The sacred center, of great importance to both Celts and Germans, represented for each community the place where the work of creation began. Eliade's main contribution was to show how various powerful symbols throughout the world have been taken at different times to represent divine power. He was influenced by the work of Jung, who claimed that echoes of early myths in dreams showed the importance of archetypal symbols, which have survived into our own time. A more ambitious scheme for the interpretation of myths was that of the French scholar Claude Lévi-Strauss, who claimed to use a more scientific approach. He advocated the structural analysis of myths, since these, like languages, are made up of units which need to be broken down if we are to comprehend them. To do this successfully, he advocated that all available versions of a myth must be brought together, in order to discover the true form, a daunting task even in the age of the computer. However, in spite of obvious difficulties, this approach has helped us to interpret mythical material, revealing the importance of polarity and contrast, and has established also the power of creative thinking possessed by what used to be called primitive peoples, which Fraser had denied. Perhaps of more relevance for the study of Celtic and Germanic mythology than these general theories of myth is the work of Georges Dumesnil, beginning in the 1920s. He concentrated on religious concepts derived from the Indo-European peoples, and placed the main gods of such peoples into three categories, which he traced back to ancient India and ancient Rome. The first of his three functions for divine figures was that of the ruler, controlling magico-religious power and law. The second was that of the warrior, employing physical force, while the third was concerned with the fertility of the earth and of living creatures. In the first class he placed the Scandinavian gods Odin and Tyr, and in the second Thor, who protected the gods with his hammer, while the group of gods and goddesses known in Scandinavia as the Varni, including Njord, Freyr and Freyja, were in the third. This approach can be used to explain certain problems in the northern myths, for instance the mysterious conflicts said to take place in the beginning between two groups of deities in both Scandinavia and Ireland. However, there are difficulties in applying Dumesnil's theories to the Scandinavian gods. Thor was indeed the champion of the divine world, like Indra, but he was also the god of law, and associated with the fertility of earth and water, while Odin, certainly a ruler and expert in magic, was essentially a warrior god, inspiring armies and supporting royal power. As for the Celtic gods, it is now recognized that individual deities were many-skilled, and cannot be fitted into neat categories like the deities of ancient Rome. This was pointed out by Marie-Louise Chaustet in her book Duet Heroes des Celts, published in 1940, which provided new and valuable insights into the study of Irish myths. She also expressed doubts as to whether any clearly defined Celtic religion ever existed to unite the people as a whole, and the same might probably be said of the religious beliefs of the Germanic peoples. However, Dumesnil's theories are of value because they have introduced new patterns to be applied to myths and deities, and helped us towards a fuller understanding of the religious needs of different sectors of society. Dumesnil somewhat neglected the goddesses, whom he at first grouped together with fertility gods in his third section. By 1970, however, he had come to the conclusion that there was one powerful goddess related to the gods of all three functions, linking and reconciling them. There has been renewed interest in the cults of the early goddesses in Europe during the last half of the 20th century. The American archaeologist Maria Gimbutas has argued eloquently for the existence of an early matriarchal society in southeastern Europe, in which the mother goddess was supreme. She believes that this was destroyed by the incursions of Indo-European warrior tribes who worshipped a powerful sky god, and has attempted to establish this by a wealth of iconographical evidence, interpreting symbols in early art. Meanwhile, an increasing number of scholars such as Bruce Lincoln and Jan Poovel have sought to trace back certain myths to the religion of the Indo-European peoples in early times. They claim that certain powerful motifs found in medieval literature in various parts of Eurasia, such as the theft of the mead of inspiration and its recovery, may go back to a very early date. There are striking parallels between myths in cultures which lie far apart, such as that of the destruction and rebirth of the world and the human race in ancient Iran and in Scandinavia in the Viking Age. It is very difficult to determine whether such resemblances are due to the preservation of ancient traditions in certain areas, or to later contacts through travel and trading and the movements of peoples, and much work remains to be done on such problems. It will be seen that varying theories of the origins of myths found in ancient Europe have inspired scholars and won popular support for a while, until it gradually became apparent that the latest theory did not after all offer a completely satisfying picture of early religion. As the sagacious Charlotte Byrne pointed out in 1901 in a review of Fraser's Golden Bough in Folklore, the fate of the solar mythologists should teach us that there is no master key to the study of ancient religions which will unlock every door. Hopes of finding a neat pattern into which all the evidence will fit, so that former theories can be rejected as completely invalid, have been doomed to disappointment. A preferred method now is to proceed by way of detailed studies of individual myths and the cults of separate deities, endeavoring to discover their history and significance. Scholars such as Hector Munro Chadwick in the first half of the 20th century and Jan de Vries a little later have, like Jacob Grimm, continued to study the field of early religion in Northern Europe with an open mind, without the urge to construct one comprehensive theory to explain it all, and in this way much progress has been made. Evidence. The written sources for early religion in Europe were for the most part recorded in Christian times, and are not necessarily trustworthy. Throughout the 20th century there was increasing reliance on archaeology and early art for the interpretation of religion, a record without words, but left by those whose beliefs and customs were based on an earlier world picture. It can tell us much of the religious beliefs and practices of those whose language is unknown to us, although it may not be easy to interpret the message aright. Every major archaeological discovery results in lengthy and often acrimonious disputes as to the dates and significance of the finds, while much valuable evidence has been lost in the past when only what interested the excavators was kept, and no full records were made. Much damage has also been done by careless treatment of unexpected finds. However, archaeological evidence has certainly helped to build up a better understanding of the lives of early peoples, offering new and practical insights into the nature of religious cults. One valuable though disconcerting characteristic of new discoveries is that they tend to contradict previously held assumptions, and require new ways of thinking. The excavation of sacred sites and graves has proved particularly illuminating for our understanding of the religion of ancient Europe. Sacred sites. In the course of the Major Ice Age, around 15,000 BCE, we have the rich cave paintings at Lascaux and other sites in southern France and northern Spain, with skillful and surprisingly sophisticated portrayal of the animals hunted, see Chapter 1 above. Evidently ritual practices went on in caves difficult of access and cut off from the light. In Scandinavia no settlement was possible until the ice receded, about 9000 BCE, and then many animal carvings were made on the rocks, together with a few figures shown dancing or in movement, which have been thought to represent priests or shamans. Diagrammatic figures of animals carved on the rocks in Scandinavia during this early period, with what appears to be a lifeline running through their bodies, are in keeping with shamanic practices among hunting peoples in later times. For the Neolithic period in northwestern Europe there are a number of sacred places marked by rings or groups of megalithic stones, of which Stonehenge and Avebury in southern England are outstanding examples. Stonehenge is now dated towards the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, and Avebury a little later, about 2500, and there is evidence for monuments of a similar kind in wood. Widely differing claims as to the identity of their builders and the purpose of such huge monuments have been put forward from medieval to modern times, including persistent attempts to link them with the Druids who belong to the Roman period, thousands of years later. This shows how difficult it is to interpret sacred sites when no records are available. In the 1960s claims were made that such monuments show considerable knowledge of astronomy and geometric skill, although these have not won general acceptance. The purpose of the long avenues of megalithic stones set up near Carnac in Brittany also remains unexplained. A more recent discovery of what may have been an important sacred centre in the Late Bronze Age in eastern England is that of Flag Fen near Peterborough, discovered by Francis Pryor in 1982, just before the area was developed as an industrial site. Here vast quantities of timber have been preserved, used to create an artificial island in a lake, and there was a long avenue from which offerings were dropped into the water. More evidence for religious practices of the Bronze Age in about 1000 BCE may be discovered here as excavations continue. From the early Celtic period in Europe a number of enclosures have been excavated which appear to have been used for sacrificial rites, such as that at Libanus in the Czech Republic. Some of these remained in use over a considerable period, and a site at Corniceronde near Compiègne in northern France was kept up from the 3rd century BCE to the 4th century CE. Such centers reveal traces of both human and animal sacrifice, as well as offerings of weapons and ornaments, and they were sometimes converted into temples after Roman occupation of the area. Ewleybury in Gloucestershire is an example of a sacred place in Britain in use for as long as 8 centuries. Here there were votive deposits and burials, while a shrine was added in the Roman period. Offering places in peat bogs have been excavated in Denmark and northern Germany. Here there is evidence for human and animal sacrifices, and large quantities of weapons and armor have been found which appear to have been offerings after victories in battle. There are allusions in Latin literature to both Celts and Germans making extravagant offerings of war booty in thanksgiving to the gods, in fulfillment of earlier vows. An early example from the Bronze Age from Denmark is a great war canoe laden with battle equipment found at Jotunheim, which had been dragged to the offering place and pelted with flints. There is a site from the Roman period at Vimos, and these are later ones at Nydam and Kragahul, Hadeslev, dating from the 4th century, and Illerup, from the 5th. Offerings of a different kind were found at Thorsbjerg and at Skidmos on the Swedish island of Åland, such as gold neck ornaments, locks of women's hair, and farm implements, and may have been made to a goddess or to fertility powers rather than to a god of battle. At Skidmos, where what was once a lake was carefully excavated from 1959 onwards, there was evidence for fires and feasting on the shore, and the remains of the food, including bones of slaughtered animals, had been taken out in boats and dropped into the water. Great temples were rare among the Celtic peoples, but some elaborate remains survive from Entremont and Roquepertuis in southern France, where the Celts were under Mediterranean influence in the 3rd century BCE. At Entremont there was a sacred way lined with impressive life-sized figures seated cross-legged, and there was evidence for the preservation of human heads, confirming literary accounts from classical sources of the customs of the Celts. Temples were also set up in sacred places in Gaul and Britain during the Roman occupation. There were a number at the sources of rivers associated with healing, like that of the goddess Sequana at the source of the Seine, or by hot springs, like that of Sulis Minerva at Bath. Such sanctuaries were often dedicated to Celtic goddesses, and they attracted crowds of pilgrims, who left offerings and votive figurines, and sometimes recorded curses against those who had robbed or injured them. In general, however, remains of temples have not survived, since both Celts and Germans held ceremonies in the open air, or used small wooden shrines likely to vanish without trace. One important site from the early Anglo-Saxon period, excavated by Brian Hope Taylor in the 1970s, is a group of halls from Yeavering in Northumberland, and one of these appears to have been used for sacrificial feasts before being abandoned after the acceptance of Christianity in the 7th century. Here the skulls and bones of many slaughtered oxen had been preserved. Disposal of the dead. Graves from the pre-Christian period have proved an important source of information, not only because of treasures buried with the dead, but also for the evidence of ritual and symbolism in funeral ceremonies which they provide. Unfortunately, many outstanding graves were opened early and treated with scant respect. An example of wanton destruction is a unique burial of the Bronze Age in a huge mound near Kivik in Sweden, opened by 2 farmers in 1748 looking for treasure, who destroyed everything except stones on which scenes of ritual and strange symbols were carved. The great tombs of the Megalithic period, some of which held many skeletal remains and seem to have been connected with a cult of the ancestors, have lost any grave goods they may have held long ago, although some stones found in them bear figures and symbols. In Brittany there are stylized female figures with breasts and staring eyes, wearing necklaces, thought to represent guardian goddesses of the dead, while there are elaborate patterns of concentric circles and spirals from the great graves of the Boyne Valley in Ireland. In Celtic areas there are a number of rich wagon graves, dating to around the early 5th century BCE. The body was usually placed in a wagon, presumably used for the funeral, with the wheels removed. One remarkable burial of this type was discovered at Vix on the Upper Seine in 1953. A woman of about 35 lay in the wagon, wearing a diadem and supplied with splendid jewelry, and among the grave goods there was an enormous jar or crater of the kind used for mixing wine and water at feasts. It has been suggested that this was an offering at a local shrine where she was priestess. From the end of the pre-Christian period there are two exceptional examples of ship graves from Anglo-Saxon England and Norway which have provided a wealth of grave goods. One is from Sutton Hoo in East Anglia, dated to the early 7th century CE, and the other from Osberg in southern Norway, from the 9th century CE. Both are thought to have been prepared for persons of royal rank, and careful excavation and preservation of the contents have revealed how elaborate pre-Christian funerals could be. At Sutton Hoo no trace of a body remained, but the mound is thought to be a grave or memorial to King Redwald of East Anglia, who reigned 599 to 625, and who although officially a Christian is said to have continued to worship the old gods. The ship was loaded with regalia worthy of a king, splendid weapons, valuable dishes and vessels for feasting, and means for preparing meals, as well as treasures appropriate for a royal hall. Some of the ornaments and weapons bear symbols known to be associated with the cult of the Germanic god Odin, though there are also objects bearing Christian symbols. One possibility is that Redwald was given Christian burial elsewhere, while his royal treasures were placed in an impressive ship which could hold 40 rowers, and buried in a mound after the custom of his ancestors. Other graves holding ships or boats in the vicinity show that ship burial was established in East Anglia at the end of the pre-Christian period. In the Osberg ship buried in a great mound in the kingdom of Vestfold in Norway, 2 women had been laid on beds, a sign of rank, and it is thought that one was a queen of Vestfold, and possibly also a priestess of the goddess Freyja. This might account for the opening of the mound not very long after the burial, and the deliberate damage done to much of the grave furniture, while one of the bodies was removed, leaving only a few bones behind. Many wooden objects in the grave were preserved owing to the composition of the soil, and some were of superb workmanship. As well as the beds there were an elaborately carved processional wagon, some carved sledges which must have been used at the funeral, and a quantity of wall hangings which have been partially restored. These are of great importance because of the scenes and figures woven and embroidered on them, including representation of a great funeral procession, in which supernatural beings take part, and scenes of battle and religious ritual. While many problems concerning these great ship burials remain unsolved, they offer a wealth of religious symbols for us to study, and possible clues for a better understanding of the picture of the otherworld held by those who planned and carried out the funeral ceremonies. There were great cremation funerals too, in Scandinavia in the Viking Age and in Germany and Anglo-Saxon England, and in some of these a ship formed the funeral pyre. We have an eyewitness account of such a funeral among Scandinavians trading in Russia in 921 CE. The Anglo-Saxon epic poem Beowulf begins with an impressive account of a dead king sent out to sea in a ship loaded with treasures, and it is often assumed that the use of ships and wagons in graves was based on a belief in the journey of the dead to another world. Reasons for their use, however, may have been more complex. A wagon used at a funeral might have been buried with the dead as an essential part of the ceremony, while a ship could be sacrificed as a status symbol, or a boat in more humble graves used as a convenient substitute for a coffin or as material for a pyre where wood was scarce. Another possible reason for use of a ship was that this was a recognized symbol for the Varni deities in the north, associated with the gods Njord and Freya and the goddess Freyja, and seems sometimes to have represented the journeying Sunday. The fact that it is a moving symbol of departure and separation, often encountered in dreams, might be one reason for its long popularity in funeral rites in Norway and Sweden, where travel over water was a familiar part of life. As well as separate graves of the rich and powerful, many inhumation and cremation cemeteries have been excavated in different parts of Europe. In Anglo-Saxon England, where evidence for the pre-Christian religion is limited, much work continues to be done on cemeteries belonging to the period of early settlement. Decoration on cremation urns includes symbols evidently associated with the dead and perhaps with certain deities. There are figures of birds, horses and boars, as well as axe heads and what may be lightning symbols. Increasing study of these, and also of the arrangement of graves and the use of earlier ones for secondary burials, adds to our knowledge of funeral ritual. Examples of animal and occasionally of human sacrifice. and the practice of placing food and drink as well as cherished possessions in the graves, continue to be recorded as more cemeteries are found, and the growing impression which we receive is that ideas about the fate of the dead were less naive and more complex than was formerly imagined. Ritual objects. Certain objects included in graves appear to have ritual significance, while other ritual items have been buried as offerings, thrown into water or hidden away in time of danger. The famous sun chariot from the Bronze Age, 60 centimeters in length, was found buried at Trondheim in Denmark, broken into fragments. This consists of a bronze disc set on wheels, covered in gold plate and elaborately decorated on one side, together with a bronze horse to draw it, perhaps one of an original pair, and the disc is thought to represent the sun. There are records also of finds of small human figures in bronze, dating from the Danish Bronze Age, c. 1600 to 500 BCE, though few have survived. They seem to have formed part of ceremonial groups, and include a kneeling figure who may represent a driving goddess, found together with a serpent. A group of this kind arranged on a wheeled platform was found in a grave of the 7th century BCE at Stretweg in Austria. This is made up of a number of naked human figures, both male and female, grouped around two stags, with a much larger figure thought to represent a goddess in the center, holding a bowl on her head. An outstanding ritual vessel from Denmark is a great silver bowl, known as the Gunderstrap Cauldron, found in a peat bog in Jutland in 1891. A series of panels had been torn off the bowl and placed inside it. Those from the outside represent 4 male and 3 female busts, assumed to be divinities, while the plates from the inside show elaborate scenes which have provoked much speculation. One shows a horned human figure sitting cross-legged beside a stag, a boar and a serpent, while on another a towering male figure is apparently putting a smaller one into a vessel, and alongside are marching or riding warriors and men playing trumpets. On the base of the bowl there is a vivid picture of a bull slaying. Certain features, such as the form of the trumpets, the neck rings of the deities, and realistic portrayal of animals such as the stag, belong to Celtic tradition, but there are other figures which are Mediterranean in style or have been thought to come from further east. Some believe that the bowl was made in Gaul, and others that it came from the area around the Black Sea. There has been much argument about its date, a favored estimate being the 1st century BCE. Another Danish treasure from about the 5th century CE was a pair of magnificent drinking horns covered with gold plates, on which were depicted small figures and scenes which appear to represent cult practices. These were found at Galahus in the 17th century, but were unhappily stolen in 1702 and melted down by the thief. The horns have been reconstructed from contemporary drawings. Iconography. The pictures on the Gunderstrap Cauldron and the Galahus horns take us into the realm of iconography. Some representations of what may be divine figures survive from early times in Scandinavia. Most carvings on the rocks from the Neolithic period are of animals, but in the Bronze Age there was a striking change. An enormous number of carvings, mostly in western Sweden, show small stylized figures of men and women who seem to be engaged in ritual practices, and who are accompanied by symbols and motifs such as sun discs, ships, footprints, plows, weapons and animals. There are also larger figures which may represent deities, holding ships or spears. Some human figures appear to have bird or animal heads, and there are groups which have been thought to represent a divine marriage. The carvings are widely scattered, but remarkably consistent in character. Supernatural beings may also be represented on amulets, such as brooches or pendants. A large number of round gold bracteates, hanging ornaments imitated from Roman medallions about the size of an old penny, were produced in Scandinavia from the 5th to the 7th century CE. The medallions had shown the head of the emperor, or scenes representing victory, and these were transformed into lively and fantastic figures and symbols by the northern craftsmen. Such bracteates were evidently worn for luck and protection. A classification system was produced by Mackaprang in 1952, and since then Carl Hock has done further extensive work on the bracteates. He believes that many show symbols associated with the Germanic god Odin, and some scenes from northern myths such as the death of Baldur or the wolf biting off the hand of the god Tyr. There is also a series of pictures on tiny pieces of gold foil, found buried in the earth, although these were placed not in graves, but usually in the foundations of buildings. 19 were discovered under the medieval church of Mer at Trondheim in Norway, believed to have been built on the site of a pre-Christian temple, and another set at Helgö in Sweden under what may have been a sacred center. The pictures on the pieces of foil are of a man and woman facing one another, sometimes embracing or with a piece of foliage between them, and this has been taken as a symbol of marriage between the fertility deities known as the Vani, associated with fruitfulness and prosperity. Individual examples found together vary in style, and they may have continued to be deposited in one place over time. Symbols which may have been linked with the gods, such as staring faces, have been recognized on Anglo-Saxon brooches. Creatures such as ravens, wolves and boars, known to be symbols of the warrior gods, were used to decorate weapons, shields, helmets and ornaments in Anglo-Saxon England and Scandinavia, and there are more elaborate figures of dancing warriors armed with spears, sometimes linked with animals. In the Viking Age, small hammers in honor of the god Thor were worn, possibly as rivals to the Christian cross, and some from Sweden are elaborately decorated to show the terrible eyes of the god, and symbolize his struggle with the world serpent. More detailed scenes are found on memorial stones of various kinds, which show figures of gods and goddesses. Such carvings are found in areas which came under Roman influence, such as Germany, Gaul, England and the Netherlands. Anthropomorphic figures of deities in the Roman manner are shown on altars and votive stones, or as statues or figurines, often with Latin inscriptions. Native deities are often identified with Roman ones, such as Jupiter, Mars or Minerva, with the native names also given, and this is a valuable source of information about local Celtic or Germanic deities. Many different local gods are represented as Mars, while Mercury may be identified with the Celtic Lugh or the Germanic Woden. We find many lively representations of Epona, the Celtic goddess associated with horses, adopted by the Romans as a goddess of cavalry regiments. Groups of mother goddesses, often 3 in number, are found in both Germanic and Celtic areas. The position was complicated when soldiers in the Roman army dedicated stones to their own native deities in the countries where they were stationed, but many undoubtedly adopted those they found in the new locality. Simple native shrines were sometimes rebuilt as elaborate temples attracting crowds of pilgrims, as happened at Bath. From Scandinavia we have many memorial stones, usually commemorating the dead. These add considerably to our knowledge of the myths when they show scenes which resemble accounts given in much later literary sources. There is a rich collection of such stones on the island of Gotland, and a number from northern England and the Isle of Man which date back to the time of the Norse settlement there. Some of the scenes from early myths are found on Christian crosses, perhaps intended to mark the contrast between the old faith and the new. On a cross at Andreas in the Isle of Man, for instance, the god Odin is shown being swallowed by the wolf beneath one of the arms of Christ's cross. Some representations are very close to accounts in the Icelandic poems of the god Thor fishing for the world serpent. This was clearly a well-known and important myth, since we have carvings depicting it from Gotland, Denmark, Sweden and northern England, which cover a period from the 8th century to the late 10th or 11th and show that the myth existed in a stable form over several centuries. Splendid carved stones were raised to commemorate the dead on the island of Gotland, and these were originally painted in bright colors, and can be as much as 10 m high. The earliest stones are dated to the 5th or 6th centuries CE, and may have been inspired by Roman tombstones from Europe seen by Gotlanders on their voyages. Some have a great whirling disc on them, with 2 smaller discs probably representing the sun and moon, and in stones from the Viking Age from the 8th century onwards a ship was often added. This could have been a status symbol, since many Gotlanders owned ships, or a symbol of the journey to the next world. Another type of journey is depicted on stones, showing a rider met by a woman who offers him a drinking horn. This appears to represent a dead hero greeted by a Valkyrie when he arrives at Odin's hall Valhalla after death in battle, as described in 10th century funeral poems. Sometimes the horse has 8 legs, which identifies it with Sleipnir, the steed used by Odin when he traveled between the worlds. Names and titles. In addition to evidence of early deities gained from art and literature, some information may be obtained from place names and personal names, as well as from names and titles of the deities themselves. The study of place names is an exacting discipline, and many interpretations accepted by earlier scholars as proof that a deity was worshipped in a certain area have now been rejected. The work of Margaret Jelling on evidence from Anglo-Saxon England and of Carl Hald in Denmark has considerably reduced the number of places thought to be named after pre-Christian deities, through rigorous checking of earlier spellings. There are a few Woden names in England, such as Woodnesborough in Kent, but in Denmark Odin, the Scandinavian equivalent of Woden, is seldom represented, and Odin names are totally lacking in Iceland. Some English place names are derived from Tuna, the thunder god, and Thor names are frequently found in Scandinavia, as are names derived from Freyr and Jord. Tyr names are rare in Norway and Sweden, but there are numerous T names in Denmark. The distribution of names raises many problems. One suggested explanation for the survival in England of names of some Anglo-Saxon deities is that the places called after them were outside the area controlled by the local ruler, and so the names failed to be suppressed at the time of the conversion. Names indicating a holy place, such as Hof in Iceland, Horga in Scandinavia and Haag in Anglo-Saxon England, also provide valuable evidence. Among the Celtic peoples, worship of the god Lugh in pre-Roman times is indicated by places named after him, such as Lyons, previously Lugudunum. Many places in Ireland are named after supernatural beings, although these are sometimes due to later folk traditions, as in the case of the Paps of Anu, a local goddess, given to two rounded hills in Kerry. Personal names are often based on those of deities. The great preponderance of Thor names in Iceland gives some idea of the god's popularity there, and similarly in West Norway, from which many Icelandic settlers came. Something may also be discovered from animal names such as Bjorn, bear, and Ulf, wolf, which can be associated with traditions about shape-changing and berserks. Divine names and titles are clearly of great importance, although they tend to raise problems rather than solve them. While some interpret the name of the Celtic god Lugh as shining, brilliant, others have derived it from a Celtic word for raven. A stock epithet applied to him, of the long arm, could either be based on his famous spear, or indicate rule over a wide territory. A powerful god would possess many titles, and as many as 70 have been listed for Odin in Old Norse literature, included god of the hanged, greybeard, roadwise, Vegtsamar, and masked one, Grimni. Clearly there are various different ways to discover more about pre-Christian cults and deities and conceptions of the other world, but no one clear method which will quickly reveal their nature. We must make good use of them all if we are to understand vanished cults and beliefs, while realizing that we must be basically dependent on written sources to build up a reliable picture of the religion and myths of ancient Europe. Religious beliefs. Indications of religion in Europe begin with fragmentary evidence from the hunting and gathering peoples during and after the Ice Age. But of the beliefs of the early peoples who inhabited Europe in the Neolithic period and the Bronze Age we in fact know little. We do not know what language they spoke and have only vague ideas about the gods they worshipped. Their religion is likely to have been a shamanic one, like that of later hunting peoples in northern Europe and Asia. The shaman, through help of guardian spirits and the ability to send out his own spirit while his body lay in a trance, was held to visit the other world and so gain hidden knowledge. Men and women with shamanic powers acted as healers and counselors, and helped to find the animals needed for food. It seems probable that in this early period the peoples of Europe worshipped supernatural guardians of the wild, both male and female, who controlled the animals they hunted and had to be treated with great respect. The concept of a powerful hunting goddess is thought by some to have been one of the earliest religious beliefs held in northern Eurasia. The great megalithic graves which spread northwards over Europe in the 3rd millennium BCE suggest that, as communities led a more settled existence, dead ancestors became increasingly important. There is some indication that bones of the dead from individual families and clans were brought together to be placed in the great stone tombs, and venerated by their descendants. In some graves in Brittany and elsewhere carvings indicate a belief in a powerful goddess who guarded the dead. Leading rulers were now able to establish great sanctuaries like Stonehenge and build impressive tombs like those at Newgrange in Ireland, and the placing of some of their monuments appears to indicate observation of the sun, moon and stars. Since established communities with sacred centers now practiced agriculture, a god of the sky became increasingly important. The sun not only caused the crops to grow, but along with the moon provided a way to keep account of time. The symbol of the sun disk was persistently carved on the rocks by peoples of the Bronze Age in Sweden, and seems to have been carried in procession, from the evidence of rock carvings depicting cult activities. In the Bronze Age we first find figures which seem to represent supernatural powers, both among the rock carvings and also in the form of bronze figurines. The carvings indicate considerable emphasis on ritual and symbolism, and appear to have been executed by members of a heroic, aristocratic society. Some have thought that these people of the Northern Bronze Age were early speakers of Indo-European, which afterwards developed into many different national groups of languages, including that of the Romans, while German scholars of the early 19th century regarded them as the direct ancestors of their race. The sky god. Once we reach the Viking Age, extending from about the late 8th to the end of the 11th century CE, we have some knowledge of the cults of the gods worshipped in Northern Europe and of the myths told about them. From literary material from Scandinavia and Iceland we learn of a company of divine beings dwelling in Asgard, always under threat from their enemies, the frost giants from Jotunheim. In the Viking Age the god of the sky was not depicted as a sun god, he was Thor, guardian of thunder and lightning, and owner of the hammer which was the lightning weapon. Tuna was the god of the early Anglo-Saxons remembered in English place names, and Dana that of the continental Germans, and these were presumably gods of a similar kind, while the Celts had a thunder god Tyrannes, and the Slavs one called Perun. Thor is known to have been worshipped with particular enthusiasm in western Norway and Iceland, and many people bore names such as Thorstein or Thorgunnar, while numerous places were called after him. His worshippers appealed to him for safe voyages and good weather, for prosperity in the local community and the rule of law. Thor plays a prominent part in the surviving myths, pictured as a powerful, red-bearded figure, possessed of an invincible hammer forged by the dwarfs, as well as a belt and gloves which gave him enormous strength. He drove across the heavens in a wagon drawn by a pair of goats, and its rattle caused the noise of thunder on earth below. Like the Hindu god Indra, with whom he has something in common, Thor had a tremendous appetite, impressing even the giants by his capacity for food and drink. Some of the myths about him are comic ones, like the tale of how he went disguised as a veiled goddess into the world of the giants to discover his stolen hammer, but the terror which his mighty power evoked as well as the warm affection in which he was held can be sensed in tales of his exploits. The gods would have been at the mercy of the giants without his hammer to protect them, and men and women turned to him for support. Since he governed the sky from which came wind and rain, he brought fertility to the land, and could give protection from storms at sea. His hammer was worn as an amulet to protect from evil and danger, as Christians wore the cross, and was depicted on memorial stones with an invocation committing the dead to his keeping. It seems also to have been used to hallow marriages, and to mark acceptance of a newborn child into the community. Appeals were made to Thor when a difficult decision had to be reached, and his image was set up not only in shrines of the gods but also in places where assemblies were held and law meetings took place, since he was the guardian of law and order. The armring on which oaths were sworn was said to be kept in his shrine, and the Icelandic assembly opened on his day, Thursday, which replaced the day of Jupiter in the Roman week. The oak tree was sacred to Thor, and there are accounts of sacred oaks being cut down by Christian missionaries in Germany and Scandinavia, while a wood sacred to Thor outside Dublin was destroyed by the Christian king Brian Boru in 1000 CE. There are many allusions to Thor's temples in the Icelandic sagas, and families coming to settle in Iceland might bring with them pillars sacred to Thor from the shrines left behind in Norway, throwing these into the sea to let Thor choose the place where they came ashore, so that the new home could be set up there. Myths about Thor are for the most part concerned with his victories over the giants who threatened the gods. Sometimes he made visits to Jotunheim, and some of the earliest skaldic verses deal with this theme. One famous journey was to the realm of the giant Geirröd, when Thor was without his hammer, but he slew the giant and his two evil daughters by breaking their backs on the rocks. Snorri Sturluson also relates a sophisticated tale of Thor's visit to the hall of the giant god Loki, where he and his companions were outwitted in various contests by deceiving magic, although the power of the god terrified the beholders. Thor also fought a duel with the giant Hrungnir, who made his way into Asgard, and on several occasions appeared with his hammer just in time to dispatch some troublesome intruder. The most famous myth about Thor, however, tells how he went fishing with an ox head for bait, and hooked the terrible world serpent which lay in the depths of the sea encircling the earth. This achievement is remembered in Icelandic poems and also depicted on stones of the Viking Age earlier than the literary sources, while some of Thor's hammer amulets are decorated with symbols of the god and the serpent. In the story as we have it, the terrified giant in the boat with Thor cut the line as the fearful head of the monster emerged from the waves, so that it sank back into the sea, but this may originally have been a creation myth in which the sky god overcomes the monster of the deep. Early poems contain allusions to many giants and giantesses slain by Thor whose tales have been lost. The war god. Although Thor is a dominant figure among the Scandinavian deities, he does not rule the divine kingdom of Asgard. This is the function of Odin, who plays a major role in the poems and myths. He was held to bring magic power, eloquence and the gift of poetry to his followers, to grant victory in battle to those he favored, and to decide the fortunes of kings and warrior leaders. Unlike Thor, he was not concerned with law and justice, and indeed was regarded as a deceiving power, ultimately forsaking his followers and treacherously condemning them to death in battle. He was also a deliberate stirrer-up of strife. Odin was regarded as the ancestor of kings, as was his counterpart Woden in Anglo-Saxon England, whose day was Wednesday. Odin's symbols were the eagle, the raven and the wolf, and these were used to adorn weapons, shields and royal treasures, as well as the spear, which was his own chosen weapon. His mighty spear Gungnir was said to be used to provoke conflict, and he could hurl it to decide victory or defeat. In Scandinavian sources, Odin's insistence on final defeat for his greatest heroes was said to be due to his need of them to defend the gods when their enemies entered Asgard. He welcomed great warriors to his otherworld hall, Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where dead kings and champions lived as warriors. Life of feasting and battle. Odin himself was a constant wanderer, seeking hidden knowledge, and in particular the secret of his own fate in the final conflict which he knew must come at Ragnarok. He journeyed between the worlds on his eight-legged horse Sleipnir, or appeared as an old, one-eyed man in a hood or a broad-brimmed hat, stirring up strife between kings. He could also take on other shapes, sometimes flying as an eagle through the air or crawling through narrow openings as a serpent. Like Thor, he sometimes visited the giants, but this was in search of information about the past or future, and his method of overcoming them was to defeat them in riddle contests, a favorite theme of Icelandic poems. He was said to be one-eyed because he had sacrificed an eye in return for hidden knowledge. In one poem, Havamal, Odin is also described as sacrificing himself on the world tree, pierced with a spear, in order to obtain knowledge of the runic symbols which he passed on to his followers. Runic letters were used for inscriptions and for divination, to bring healing or to cause injury, as well as providing magical protection and luck. Runic lore was associated with Odin, as was the gift of eloquence and the power to compose poetry, and one of the best-known myths is that of his recovery of the mead of inspiration from the giant who had gained possession of it. The poems tell of his many names, and of his skill in magic, as well as his power over the fates of kings. He could help warriors in battle, and the binding and unbinding of fetters, the hurling of spears and resistance to battle panic were held to be under his control. He was said to instruct young heroes, granting them gifts such as swords, armor and fine horses. Above all, he could give men ecstasy in battle, so that his chosen followers, the berserks, were free from fear and believed themselves impervious to wounds. Odin was served by supernatural women, the Valkyries, who rode through the air, carried out his commands by ensuring victory or defeat as he willed, and conducted the distinguished leaders of armies to his realm when they fell on the battlefield. Odin could visit the underworld when he needed to consult the dead, and the Germanic Woden worshipped by the continental Germans appears to have been mainly an underworld deity. However, the eagle symbol, perhaps borrowed from the Roman emperors, linked him with the sky as well as with the depths. He was also said to have a seat high in the world tree, from which he could look out over all realms, while his two ravens also journeyed far and brought him tidings. As depicted in the Viking Age, he is a complex figure, and because he was worshipped by aristocratic warriors, many myths concerning him were taught to young men and recited in royal halls, so that they have survived into later times. While many memorial stones bear scenes of heroes arriving in Valhalla, those raised in Gotland from the 8th to the 10th century CE, as well as funeral poems describing kings entering Valhalla, indicate the importance of the warrior god among the ruling classes. It was rare, however, for either people or places to be named after Odin, and in Iceland, where there was no king to rule them, people turned increasingly to Thor. Evidently, the cult of a warrior god was important before the Viking Age, to judge from the extravagant sacrifices of war equipment, horses and even warships which have been found in the peat bogs of Denmark from the early centuries of the Christian era. The identity of such gods before the cult of Odin was established in Scandinavia, however, is not easy to determine. One of them may have been Tyr, earlier *Tywars. The single myth which survives about him tells how when the wolf Fenrir was reared among the gods, only Tyr was bold enough to feed and care for him. A magic chain was forged to hold him which could not be broken, but the wolf refused to have it round his neck unless someone would put a hand in his mouth as a pledge that he would not remain a captive. Tyr was the only one willing to do this, and he lost his hand, but Fenrir was fettered and fated to remain so until Ragnarok, when he would break loose and devour Odin. The powers of fertility. Odin, Thor and Tyr belonged to the race of the Aesir, but there was a second group of deities known as the Vani, to which the god Njord and his son and daughter, Freya and Freyja, belonged. Freya was a powerful god in Sweden, and although the Vani deities were associated mainly with peace and plenty, he was regarded as the supporter of the Swedish kings in warfare. His boar symbol was said to protect the lives of warriors, and was worn as a crest on early Anglo-Saxon and Swedish helmets, while the kings of Sweden in the period before the Viking Age apparently possessed great helmets like boar masks. Njord, Freya's father, was a god associated with ships and with seas and lakes, which in Scandinavia were an important source of food. One myth about Njord tells of his marriage with Skadi, a giant's daughter, but they afterwards parted because she could not bear to live near the sea and he hated the mountains which were her domain. The widespread custom of burying the dead in boats and ships, or of using a ship as a funeral pyre, may possibly have had links with the Vani. Freya himself possessed a wonderful ship which could sail against wind and tide, while other symbols associated with him were the horse and the boar. Sacred horses were said to have been kept in his sanctuaries, and Freya and Freyja possessed a golden boar which ran across the heavens and descended below the sea at night, evidently associated with the sun. There are accounts of worshippers of Freya setting up temples to him in Iceland, and the sagas preserve memories of rivalry between his cult and that of Odin. Freya, like Odin, was closely linked with kingship. He was said to have been the first ruler of Sweden, and to have been represented by the kings who succeeded him. The Danes had a similar tradition of a series of kings called Frodi, renowned for their prosperous reigns. Sometimes their bodies were borne round the land when they died to bring fertility, and sacrifices were made at their burial mounds, as in the case of Freya. The impression left by these somewhat confused traditions is that the kings reigning at Uppsala were regarded as successors of Freya, and there is no doubt of the importance of royal ancestors in their burial mounds in the sacred centers of their kingdoms in the early Viking Age, believed to bring prosperity to the realm. This concept seems to have preceded the idea of the king journeying to Valhalla to dwell with Odin after death. The goddesses also belonged to the Vani, although some who made marriages with the gods were said to be daughters of giants. There is no doubt of their power and importance, and there were halls sacred to them in Scandinavia, even though comparatively little information has come down to us in the mythical literature, mainly composed by men for a male audience. The two leading goddesses were Freyja, the sister and perhaps also the bride of Freya, and Frigg, queen of heaven and wife of Odin, and it is possible that these are two different aspects of the same great goddess. Other lesser figures such as Idun, who guarded the golden apples giving the gods perpetual youth, and Gefion, who ploughed round a tract of land in Sweden and then dragged it to Denmark to form the island of Zealand, may again possibly be representations of the same goddess, functioning under different names in separate localities. The literary sources have a good deal to tell us about lesser beings who might be seen as linked with the Vani, since they could bring fertility to flocks and herds and to the earth, and a covenant made with such local powers would bring good luck and prosperity in hunting and farming. There were guardian spirits attached to certain families, and land spirits, male and female, dwelling in rocks and stones and hills. These were said to be encountered by the early settlers who came to Iceland, who found that they would give counsel in dreams and bring good fortune if their favor could be won. There are references too to the Norns, female spirits akin to the goddesses who determined the destiny of the individual at birth, and to the following ones, Fylgja, which accompanied human beings through life, sometimes in female and sometimes in animal form. Such supernatural beings must be recognized as part of the religious background of the Viking Age, together with the more complex figures of the major gods and goddesses. Enigmatic gods. There are other figures said to dwell in Asgard of whom we know little, but who may have been prominent in earlier times. Mimi is said to guard the spring of wisdom, and there is an allusion in a poem to Odin sacrificing an eye in return for a drink from Mimi's well, although this may possibly be a borrowing from Irish tradition. Another mysterious character is Yule, called God of the Shield, after whom places in Scandinavia were named, who may have been one of the Vani. Another is Heimdall, called the White God, whose keen ears could catch the faintest sound, who sat guarding the bridge into Asgard ready to blow his horn if any danger threatened the gods. He is called the son of 9 mothers, apparently giantesses connected with the sea, and in one of the poems of the Edda, Rigsthula, he appears as Rig, the progenitor of the various classes of society, thrall, farmer and jarl. This is another myth which has been thought to show Irish influence. Heimdall was the sworn enemy of Loki, one of the most enigmatic inhabitants of Asgard, who appears in many myths. He was a frequent companion of the gods, although sometimes he is represented as a giant, and he supports the giants when they attack the stronghold of the gods at Ragnarok. The monsters who threaten the safety of Asgard, the world serpent and the wolf, together with Hel, the sinister goddess ruling the realm of death, are all said to have been begotten by Loki. In the myths, Loki appears mainly as a trickster, whose pranks brings trouble to the gods and arouse their anger, as when he cut off the hair of Thor's wife Sif, or helped a giant to steal the golden apples which kept them young. However, he always finds a way to save himself by some ingenious plan to put things right, helped by his ability to change shape and become bird, animal or fish at will. He persuades the dwarfs to make new hair of gold for Sif, and flies in the shape of a hawk to retrieve the goddess and her apples from the giant, while when Thor's hammer is stolen it is Loki who masterminds Thor's journey to Jotunheim disguised as Freyja in order to recover it. When the gods were threatened by a giant building a wall for them round Asgard, Loki took on the shape of a mare and lured away the giant's horse which was assisting him, so that the builder failed to fulfill his contract and was killed. The result of this was the birth of Sleipnir, Odin's wonderful horse with 8 legs, and indeed the dubious exploits of Loki often resulted in enormous benefits to the gods, and the creation of some of their greatest treasures. But he did not retrieve the situation after he caused the death of Baldur, Odin's son, and the gods took vengeance by binding him under a rock beneath snakes which dropped poison on him from above, there to remain until Ragnarok. The figure of the bound Loki with his wife beside him appears to be depicted on the Gosforth cross in Cumberland. Baldur is another puzzling figure, who is called the son of Odin, but whom the Danish historian Saxo represents as a human hero. Snorri describes him as the fairest of the gods, and it is indicated in the Edda poems that Odin knew that threats to Baldur's life would mark the beginning of the final catastrophe. As Snorri recounts the myth, Baldur's mother, the goddess Frigg, took oaths from all living things and even inanimate ones that they would never harm him, but she neglected to include the mistletoe. Through the malice of Loki, a blind god, Hother, another obscure character in Asgard, flung a dart of mistletoe at Baldur in sport, and slew him. Snorri then gives an elaborate account of Baldur's funeral, attended by all the gods, and tells how a messenger was sent to the kingdom of Hel, the goddess of the dead, to bring him back to Asgard. Hel agreed that he should return if all on earth, including inanimate things, wept for him, but once again Loki intervened, taking on the form of an old giantess who brusquely refused to lament over Baldur's death. While the tale is in keeping with myths of a slain fertility god in other religions, there is no convincing evidence of worship of Baldur as a god in Scandinavia or Germany, and we do not know the source from which Snorri derived the powerful myth of his death, or that of the ride to Hel to rescue him. The world of the gods. The mythological geography associated with gods and giants is well developed in Old Norse literature. In the center of the 9 worlds inhabited by various races of beings, including the people of Earth, stood the world tree, the Yggdrasil, and around this and beneath its roots were grouped the different worlds, although their names and exact positions are never clearly specified. Hel, the world of the dead, since Valhalla was reserved for kings and heroes, lay under its roots. While others appear to be high above, and Asgard, the world of the gods, is said to be reached by a rainbow bridge running across the heavens. The concept of a tree which rises through a series of worlds is found in northern Eurasia, and forms part of shamanic lore, possibly based on the pole star in the center of the heavens. An eagle was said to perch on the world tree, and a serpent to twine round its roots, while Odin had his seat high among the branches and could look into all worlds. Odin was said to have hung from the tree, pierced with a spear, as a sacrifice in order to discover the secrets of runic magic. Jotunheim, the realm of the frost giants, could be reached from Asgard, but the journey was long and difficult. So also was the route to Hel, the kingdom of death. There are graphic descriptions in the poems of the vast expanses between the worlds, over mountains and across rivers. There was also a second realm of the gods where the Vani lived, Vanaheim, and it was said that at one time there was a war between the 2 races, although they afterwards concluded a truce and dwelt together in Asgard. Since most of our literary evidence comes from late in the Viking Age or after its close, there are many gaps in our knowledge of the earlier beliefs, and the cult of Odin is the one of which we hear most. But it seems as if the community of the gods was a well-established feature in Germanic religion. They were honored as a group at the main religious feasts, which all were expected to attend, and several deities are mentioned together in oath formulas. In the poem Völuspá we have a convincing picture of the gods sitting in council together and establishing order in the world, and 3 are mentioned as joining together in the creation of humankind, after the earth was formed from the body of a dead giant Emir. Tacitus in the 1st century CE refers to the Germans appealing to the gods as a group. At the regular religious feasts dividing up the year, ale or mead was hallowed to the gods, and there was a sacrificial killing of either a boar, a bull or a stallion to provide a feast for the gods and the community. This however did not prevent an individual from adopting a particular god or goddess as guardian and protector, and raising a shrine on his land to worship the chosen deity. Christianity for many meant adopting Christ in this way, without rejecting other gods preferred by one's neighbors. The Scandinavian kings gave special worship to Odin or Freyr, and worshippers of Freyr or Thor continued to support their cults after they moved to Iceland, raising shrines to them there. There was no highly organized priesthood, and when a king was present it was he who took the leading part in the ritual at the feast, or else the local chieftain, as in Iceland, where he might well also have been the builder of the shrine where a god was worshipped. Sacrifices to the gods were usually animals, but human sacrifices of prisoners of war were made in return for victory. Such sacrifices might be decided by drawing lots, so that the will of the gods might be made manifest. There might also be occasional sacrifices at funerals, and we know from one detailed account from the 10th century that a slave girl was killed to provide a bride for a warrior leader who died among Scandinavians on the Volga, far from home, and was cremated on his ship with the body of the girl beside him. This account was written by a reliable Arab scholar and diplomat who witnessed it in 921 CE. The girl was strangled and stabbed, in accordance with the rites of Odin. Much of the literature concerned with Odin has references to the end of the worlds of gods and humankind at Ragnarok, when their enemies endeavor to bring back the cold, darkness and chaos which existed before the founding of Asgard and the setting up of the sun and the moon. First the wolf swallows the sun, and there is a terrifying 3-year winter, without light or heat. Then the foes of the gods force a way into the stronghold, and in the final battle those on both sides are destroyed, in spite of Odin's splendid army of heroes, summoned by the horn of Heimdall, and the might of Thor. The giants, along with Loki who like the monsters has broken loose from his bonds, come by sea against Asgard, while the sons of Muspel, a band of enemies associated with fire, ride across the rainbow bridge and shatter it beneath their weight. The wolf and the serpent advance to fulfill their destiny, although they too perish. Odin is devoured by the wolf, which is then slain by the god's young son, while Thor destroys the world serpent but is killed by its poison. Freya is overcome by Surt, a giant who brings fire to destroy the earth, and the old enemies Heimdall and Loki slay one another. Fire rages over the earth, and finally the sea overwhelms it. Such is the account given by Snorri Sturluson, based on the memorable poem Völuspá, Prophecy of the Seers, in the Poetic Edda, believed to have been composed about 1000 CE. Here we are told also that this is not the final chapter in the earth's history. It will rise again from the sea, cleansed by fire and water, and the sons of the gods, presumably with the goddesses, will survive to establish creative order once again, while a man and woman who have been sheltered in the world tree will emerge to repeople the earth. This powerful myth of the last days has been preserved in great clarity, and shows some striking resemblances to Iranian myths of the world's ending. It may be based on an ancient mythical conception which survived into the Viking Age through its association with the god Odin. The climate of Iceland, with its terrible volcanic eruptions, some of which took place in early medieval times and included flooding and tidal waves, gave its people the experience of the extremes of cold and heat, and may have lent a new emphasis to earlier traditions. Irish mythology. Christianity was introduced early into Ireland, so that there is no direct literary evidence for pre-Christian myths as in Iceland, but written sources of the Christian period have preserved some material about mythological figures about whom stories were remembered. Divine characters sometimes appear as members of royal families or as outstanding heroes, and some have a good deal in common with the Norse deities, although the Celtic gods are perhaps more complex in their attributes and powers. There are tales of the Dagda, whose name means good god, and who bears some resemblance to Thor in that he is a rather primitive figure armed with a club, with abundant strength and energy and a huge appetite. The title good is not based on moral virtue, but on his skills and abilities. He was expert in warfare, magic and building, and was hailed as Lord of Perfect Knowledge. Like Thor with his hammer, he could not only kill with his club but also restore to life. He was renowned for his hospitality, and his cauldron was a symbol of abundance, while he was known also for his sexual vigor. Although represented as a rough and somewhat grotesque figure in the tales, he was undoubtedly a deity of great and varied powers. Certain features are shared by the Irish god Lugh and the Norse Odin, while Lugh and the Germanic Woden, Odin's predecessor, were both identified by the Romans with Mercury. Place names show that Lugh was known in Gaul, Holland and Silesia. Lyons, the capital of Gaul, was named after him, as was Lugavalium, later Carlisle, in Roman Britain. He has more inscriptions in his honor than any other Celtic deity, and there are legends of saints demolishing his temples and statues. He is a more sophisticated figure than the Dagda. His name probably means the Shining One, and he is often depicted as young and beardless. In Irish tradition he was many-skilled, excelling as smith, harper, poet, healer and craftsman, and he possessed kingly attributes, and is described as sitting in state beside the maiden who represented the sovereignty of Ireland. Like Odin, he was armed with a great spear, could give help in battle and was skilled in magic. He also fathered heroes, and the great Siu Tulain was said to be his son. His festival, Lugnasa, was held on the 1st of August, and was celebrated on hilltops in Ireland. Some have believed Lugh to be a very ancient deity, going back to the time of the Indo-Europeans. A third god remembered in Ireland who seems also to have been worshipped in Gaul was Don, associated with death and the underworld. He plays little part in the literary sources, but is remembered in local traditions surviving into modern times. His home, House of Don, is still said to be on a small island off the coast of Kerry, where he welcomes athletes such as footballers and hurlers who die young. He is described as a gloomy lord of the dead who also ruled the storm, and the dead were sometimes said to be seen traveling to his realm, so that he bears some resemblance to the Germanic Odin. He is named in the literature as one of the sons of Mil who invaded Ireland and defeated the Tuatha, the company of the gods. This tradition of warfare between two groups of supernatural beings is in agreement with Norse tradition of a war between the Aesir and the Vanir, but it is set in a different framework, and we are told more about the actual fighting. There are accounts in the literature of the first and second battles of Magtwid, and how the Tuatha finally took Lug as their leader. His spear and the sword of another god, Nuadu, from which there was no escape once it left the scabbard, proved invincible weapons. Nuadu lost a hand in the battle, but had it replaced by a silver one. Little is known of him, but he may be the same as the god Nodens, worshipped at Lydney Park in Gloucestershire in Roman times. Some scholars also stress the importance of a god Senanos, horned one, which they identify with the horned figure sitting beside a stag on the Gunderstrap Cauldron. This name is only known from a single inscription on an altar from Paris, and may be a title, since horns were worn by various deities as a sign of power. There is some evidence, however, for an earlier male god of the wild creatures, worshipped by Celtic hunters. Another impressive deity in Irish literature is Mananan Makla, son of the sea, whose name is related to that of the Isle of Man, and who bears some resemblance to the Norse Heimdall. He was associated with a joyous underworld beneath the waves, and with voyages to enchanted islands. There are a number of tales in the literature of kings and heroes summoned to a wonderful realm across the sea, where existence is free from sorrow, death and corruption, and there are beautiful women to welcome the visitor. Here orchards bear golden apples, and these, as in Norse tradition, are said to bring the gift of eternal youth. This land has many strange names, such as Land of Promise, Land of the Young, Land of Women or Plain of Delight. Other fantastic tales of voyages to islands of marvels have been preserved in the literature. While there is no equivalent of the Ragnarok tradition in Irish sources, the account of the Second Battle of Magtwid bears certain resemblances to it in the prophecies of disaster and destruction Tokon, and in both cases a desperate struggle is finally succeeded by the birth of a new age. Since the influence of Christian learning has to be taken into account in the written sources, it is not possible to determine what concepts of the ending of an age may have formed part of both Celtic and Germanic religious beliefs. There is no real evidence of borrowing on either side, but both peoples seem to look back on older traditions of creation, destruction and renewal. As in Norse mythology, there are traces of cults of powerful goddesses in Ireland, and these are supported in later popular tradition. The figure of the Hag of Bear is particularly associated with the Bear Peninsula in southwest Ireland, but legends about her survive elsewhere and also in parts of Scotland, and there are strong indications that she has developed from an ancient mother goddess, linked with creation, wild nature, sovereignty, war and death. Another outstanding figure is that of Brigid, who has been partly transformed into a revered Christian saint, but must be linked with the goddess Brigantia worshipped in northern Britain at the time of the Roman invasion, who could bring victory and also healing. Brigid was associated with the welfare of flocks and herds, and such skills as weaving, brewing and butter making, as well as poetry and traditional learning, and she may have descended from the chief goddess worshipped in Gaul whom Julius Caesar identified with Minerva. We know the names of many goddesses worshipped by the Celtic peoples in Britain and Gaul from the monuments raised in their honor during the Roman occupation. Temples dedicated to them attracted crowds of pilgrims seeking healing, who sometimes left wooden figures behind with indications of their disabilities, as at the Temple of Sequana at the source of the Seine. Some goddesses were adopted by the Romans, as was the goddess of the hot springs at Bath, and also the riding goddess Epona. Taken over as patron of the Roman cavalry regiments, whose cult attracted both military men and horse breeders. Such goddesses could be concerned with warfare as well as healing. One from Brittany had a helmet with an aggressive goose as a crest, while Boudica, the queen of the Iceni in eastern England, is said to have appealed to a war goddess Adraste for help in her revolt against the Romans, and to have massacred Roman women as offerings. Destructive goddesses of battle and violence are found in the Irish sagas, particularly the Babd and the Morrigan. They could stir up warfare and strike fighting men with terror, and like the Norse Valkyries who also appeared on the battlefield, they are associated with the birds of prey, crows and ravens which feast on the dead. Some goddesses were linked with male gods, as was Rosmerta, shown frequently with the god Mercury, who has no regular partner in the Greco-Roman tradition. The mother goddess is also shown singly or as a pair, but more often as three female figures who may be of different ages or character, were clearly of importance in local religious belief. Like the land spirits of Scandinavia, they were linked with the fertility of the earth, and often depicted holding fruit, particularly apples, but also with the well-being of the family, symbolized by the babies they often hold in their arms. Thus both gods and goddesses remembered in Ireland fit into a wider group of Celtic deities in Britain and on the continent, although no coherent picture of a shared religion of the Celts survives. Religions of the Celts. An important difference between the Celts and the Germans is that in Roman times the Celtic peoples in Western Europe had a powerful priesthood. According to Greek and Roman writers, three important classes in Celtic society were those of Druids, bards and seers. The Druids, who have been compared to the Brahmins of India and the pontiffs of Rome, were said to organize sacrifices, make legal decisions and teach religious traditions, but their knowledge was not recorded in writing. They also predicted future events and interpreted the will of the gods, and a bronze ritual calendar found at Coligny in France appears to have been used to help in divination, perhaps to choose auspicious days for various activities. There are traces of a similar system of Druids, bards and seers in Ireland, and references in the literature to Druids advising the rulers, while Tacitus records how the Romans destroyed a number of Druids on the island of Anglesey in Wales in 60 CE. The brief accounts of these undoubtedly influential figures caught the imagination of 18th-century writers, and there were continual attempts to romanticize and revive them. Certainly they must have helped to shape religious beliefs, whereas among the Scandinavian peoples this appears to have been the work rather of poets, storytellers, seers and seeresses. The Germanic priests do not seem to have had recognized religious centers, but merely functioned at sacrificial rituals, and even there it was the kings who took the prominent part. The Druids underwent long periods of training, and there were presumably lesser priests in the shrines set up for single or small groups of deities. The Celts had few large temples, but at those at Entremont and Roquepertuis in southern France, established before the Roman conquest of Gaul, there were impressive statues of gods or ancestors in stone, and here heads of enemies killed in battle or captured and sacrificed were preserved. This continued to be an accepted practice among the Celts, borne out by both literary and archaeological evidence, and there are accounts in the Irish sagas of the head of a vanquished champion being treated with great honor and set up to preside over a feast. As in Scandinavia and Anglo-Saxon England, sacrificial feasts formed an important part of Celtic religious ritual, and many are described in the Irish sagas. The Irish had four main feasts throughout the year: Imbolc in February, Beltane in May, Lugnasa in August and Samhain in October, marking important points in the agricultural and farming year. Mead or ale and the cauldron holding it formed an essential element in the religious feast, and there was ritual distribution of the meat of the sacrificial boar according to the rank and prestige of those taking part, not surprisingly a frequent cause of strife. Irish literature contains accounts also of the ritual for the choosing of a king, when a bull or a horse might be sacrificed. The small tribal territories would each have its own sacred center, as among the Germanic peoples. The water of springs, lakes and rivers was of particular importance, and there might be places dedicated to supernatural beings close by, where offerings were left, or thrown into the water. Indeed, the conditions under which Germanic and Celtic peoples lived before the acceptance of Christianity were generally similar, in spite of variations caused by the entry of Roman culture into the lives of many tribes when they became part of the Roman Empire. They were led by warrior kings, anxious to gain new and fruitful land for their people, supporting themselves by agriculture, hunting and adventurous trading by land and sea, as well as by raiding and piracy. They lived in an oral tradition which set considerable value on skills in poetry and oratory, the preservation of ancient learning and the rites of divination. It is therefore hardly surprising to find that similar patterns can be traced in their religion and myths. Religion in everyday life. Although in ancient Europe religion extends over so great a time span and most of our knowledge comes from the close of the pre-Christian period, it is probable that there was no great difference in the way which it affected the lives of the ordinary people from the time that agriculture began to be practiced in the Neolithic period. Names of gods and goddesses and tales about them varied, as did local rituals, but a believer in the gods of the Viking Age need not have been wholly lost if he found himself present at a religious festival of the Bronze Age. One major change in religious practice came when the life of hunters and gatherers gave way to the establishment of settled communities growing crops and herding animals, while the second came with the introduction of Christianity. The framework of early religion formed part of the life of the whole community under the king who ruled it, so that the early Christian missionaries found it essential to get the goodwill and support of the ruler when they entered non-Christian territories. There were no small exclusive groups, and there was no attempt to convert from the cult of one deity to another, although an individual or a family was often devoted to a particular god or goddess. Although the power of a deity was not confined to one particular sphere, certain powers were held to be suitable to call upon for special needs. Thus one of the early Christians in Iceland, Helgi the Lean, was said to continue to appeal to Thor when he needed good luck on a voyage. The women naturally turned to a goddess for help in family matters, childbirth and household skills, but worship of goddesses was by no means confined to women. Warlike leaders like Jarl Hakon of Norway might give devoted worship to a chosen goddess, while both men and women flocked to shrines of the goddesses for healing. House spirits and land spirits might also be called upon by both men and women. It was the men, however, who performed the worshipping rituals of the deities protecting the beasts of the forest and wild areas, and this continued long after farming was established. Military matters were also largely their concern, but not exclusively so. There were women leaders in Britain and Ireland who appear to have taken a leading part in battle, turning to goddesses for support. The emphasis in Old Norse literature on the strongly masculine cult of Odin, recorded by men concerned with the doings of kings, may be slightly misleading. At the feasts marking stages of the agricultural year, sacrificial food and drink specially brewed for the occasion was shared with the gods. In Scandinavia, the purpose of such feasts seems to have been to renew contact with the gods and so ensure their continued support and protection, and on such occasions all would want to take part. The blood of the sacrifice was deemed to possess great power, and might be sprinkled in the shrines of the gods, while Christians mocked at the Swedes for licking out the sacrificial bowls. Horns and hides of cattle killed for the feast were often hung up as a record, and the skulls of sacrificed animals retained. Again, the drinking of ale or mead dedicated to the gods was a solemn moment, and vows might be made as the horn was passed round. Another time when people joined together in worship was when religious processions were held and symbols of the gods carried round. Again, animal sacrifices might take place, and offerings be left in earth or water. Such ceremonies might be at certain times of the agricultural year, such as harvest, or on special occasions such as a victory. The rock carvings of the Bronze Age in Sweden give the impression that there were many such processions and rituals associated with divine symbols. Also, at times of calamity such as plagues among people or cattle, failure of crops, disastrous weather or defeat in battle, there would be offerings to the gods to entreat their help. Work done by Ralston in 19th century Russia, recording chants and ceremonies when Christian saints or biblical characters such as Elijah were evoked to bless the sowing or avert some danger, gives us some idea of local rituals in pre-Christian times. People also came together at the funerals of kings and queens or leading persons, and the evidence of archaeology has shown how impressive such inhumation or cremation ceremonies could be. Funeral customs varied in different areas and periods, and families might have individual traditions, but the coming together for a memorable funeral was something at the heart of religion from the Neolithic period onwards. Mounds raised over the grave of the royal dead or the ashes of their funeral pyres often marked the sacred center of a kingdom, and offerings were made to the ancestors who rested in them. Such impressive ceremonies helped to strengthen belief in an afterlife, although the literary evidence suggests that there was no general agreement as to the form which this might take. Simple ideas of a life continuing in the grave were mingled with traditions of a long and perilous journey to the land of the dead, and of a reception there by the supreme god or by one's dead kinsman. The idea that kings and great warriors were received after death in the Hall of Odin was one special conception of the afterlife developed by poets and sculptors in Scandinavia, but this was reserved for one particular class of aristocratic warrior. The communal gatherings enabled people to keep in touch with the supernatural world and the deities who ruled it. There might also be lesser offerings of food and drink or part of the harvest, and personal offerings such as plaits of women's hair or ornaments might be thrown into water or left in the peat bogs. There is ample evidence for sacrifice of booty won in war, including horses and captives, in accordance with vows made before battle. When human sacrifice took place, the victims were mostly slaves, prisoners of war or malefactors. However, in assessing the archaeological evidence, it is not easy to differentiate between sacrifice and execution. Links with the other world might be made during the simple pursuits of everyday life, taking place in the home, in fields and woods, or on a journey. In the Scottish Highlands, Alexander Carmichael recorded prayers and appeals to Mary, Bridget and Christ to accompany various options. And these may well reflect earlier pre-Christian appeals and incantations. Reliance on help and protection from supernatural powers did not originate in Christian times, and was easily adapted to Christian teaching. Indeed, many former religious traditions could be merged with the new practices of the Church, as is evident from accounts of conversions in the Icelandic sagas. The feasts could be replaced by gatherings at Christian festivals, and the sanctity of food and drink could help towards an understanding of the Mass. Lesser supernatural guardians of the past could be replaced by guardian angels and chosen saints. Even the myth of Odin hanging on the world tree pierced by a spear, for which there is plenty of evidence for a pre-Christian origin in the hanging and stabbing of sacrificial victims, could have helped northern converts to accept the belief in the crucified Christ. The Anglo-Saxon poem The Dream of the Rood, in which the tree from which the cross was made speaks, and Christ is represented as a young warrior, shows how mythical concepts could come together with the new Christian teaching to inspire great religious poetry. Communication with the other world could be established in various ways. One was by dreams, in which advice or warning could be conveyed by a supernatural helper, and some of those described in the literature could come under the category of visions. Since dreams were found in the Bible, they were not disapproved of by the Church, and many recorded in Icelandic literature contain vivid pre-Christian imagery. Sometimes the gods or helpful spirits appeared in dreams, and sometimes dark and sinister forms gave warnings of evil to come, while messages might also be received from the dead. Sleeping on a burial mound or on the hide of a sacrificed bull could bring significant dreams to the sleeper. There were skilled interpreters of dreams, and men and women expert in other ways of ascertaining what the future held were important members of the community. We hear of seers and seeresses in Scandinavia and of Druids in the Irish sagas. Shamanism continued among the Inuit and the Sami in the north and in Russia throughout the pre-Christian period, and must have influenced Scandinavian divination ceremonies. It was customary to turn to a god for counsel when important decisions had to be made, and the community also sought to learn by divination what sort of harvest was promised and where hunting would be profitable, as well as what the result of a conflict with an enemy would be. Both Old Norse and Old Irish literature are rich in examples of methods used by seers to gain inspiration, and poetic inspiration was linked with this and regarded as a divine gift. There was much consulting of omens, such as the movements of birds, the behavior of sacred horses and observation of the natural world, and seers in Ireland might watch the spread of forest fires or listen to the noise of the sea. While the outcome of chance might be governed by supernatural powers, the idea of an implacable fate was a powerful concept in the pre-Christian past. The destiny of kings was emphasized in the early heroic literature, but that of each child born was also taken seriously, and female guardians of destiny, such as the Scandinavian Norns, were held to determine this at birth. The concept of fate as a power higher even than the gods was strongly established in northern literature, and vividly expressed in the Scandinavian myth of Ragnarok. Since there were no means of recording religious traditions in writing other than the restricted use of runic characters before the coming of Christianity, they were passed on in oral tradition, in poems about the gods and countless legends and myths related by storytellers, along with a wealth of symbols. This kept traditions alive but resulted in considerable flexibility and local variation, although the general pattern of beliefs seems to have remained constant. Contacts with the civilization of the Roman Empire and later with Christianity were bound to influence symbols and myths in the last period of pre-Christian religion from which most of our evidence is taken. Yet although much of this religion remains obscure and confusing to us now, an increasing amount of evidence can be found in the study of early literature, art and archaeology if we are prepared to approach this with caution and humility. Bibliography. Chippendale, circa 1983. Stonehenge complete. London, Thames and Hudson. Doomsill, G. 1973. Gods of the Ancient Norsemen, E.D.E. Haugen. Berkeley, University of California Press. Davidson Ellis, H. R. 1988. Myths and Symbols of Pagan Europe, Early Scandinavian and Celtic Religions. Manchester, Manchester University Press. 1993, The Lost Beliefs of Northern Europe. London, Routledge. 1998, Roles of the Northern Goddess. London, Routledge. Evans, 8th circa 1986. Sutton Hoo Ship Burial. London, British Museum Publications. Green, M. 1986. The Gods of the Celts. Gloucester, Alan Sutton. 1995, Celtic Goddesses. London, British Museum Press. And a number of other works by this author, on archaeology and symbolism of the Celts. Hutton, R. 1967. The Pagan Religions of the British Isles, Their Nature and Legacy. Oxford, Blackwell. Matt Karner, P. 1982. Celtic Mythology. New Eden, Feltham, Nunes Press. An excellent general picture. Nastrom, born in 1995. Fraser, The Great Goddess of the North. Lund Studies in History of Religions 5. Lund, University of Lund. O'Again, D. 1990. Myth, Legend and Romance, An Encyclopedia of Irish Folk Tradition. London, Ryan Publishing. An extremely useful and reliable book on individual characters and myths. Owen, G. R. 1981. Rites and Symbols of the Anglo-Saxons. Newton Abbott, David and Charles. Piggott, S. 1968. The Druids. Harmansworth, Penguin. A Good Critical Study. Powell, T. G. E. 1958. The Celts. Ancient Peoples and Places. London, Thames and Hudson. Strong on archaeological side. Rees, A. and born in 1961. Celtic Heritage, Ancient Tradition in Ireland and Wales. London, Thames and Hudson. Schoedstedt, M. 1982. Gods and Heroes of the Celts, Trans. M. Dillon. Berkeley, University of California Press. Terville Petre, E. O. G. 1964. Myth and Religion of the North. London, Weidenfeld and Nicholson. Concentrates on textual evidence.